actors and players who would say, but we've never really defined diaspora, and here we are with, many, generations of experience of diaspora, and we're still stuck with the definition. And yet we have, millions of people who have been living living out diaspora lives, if you like, in different forms and parts. And yet in the development space, we get stuck. So often I wonder, maybe we're trying to define something that doesn't exist because we are not really being convinced by what we have as a phenomena and trying to support what is really important for diaspora engagement. And I think the same would happen in the space of remittances. I'm just also thinking and reflecting, Professor Benoit, your response actually to the question around that remittances could also sometimes be a divider. And I'm thinking about being a divider in terms of raising that inequality in particular spaces, particularly when you look in regions and countries where you've got regions that have the high propensity for people to migrate, and therefore they would also have larger group of migrants out there. But also it can talk a lot about the education system that's there within a particular country and the divisions that are there. So those who have had access to basic education or a certain type of skill set that is desired by a group. But then also just thinking a little bit more about the feminization of labor migration, and we're talking about domestic workers or nurses who have become a very important source of who are participating in a foreign labor market in a lot of countries in the Gulf, in different parts of the world as well, and how that actually has changed the family setups in different spaces. It was really interesting also speaking the other day to a young lady who was speaking about domestic workers in Ethiopia, and how towards a sense of having a return gives one to think as a migrant, yes, all these remittances have gone and built other people's lives, but because of the status of migrants in the Gulf, that they are not allowed to sort of have a family where they are, really her life was going to now begin when she's about to go back to Ethiopia. And this young lady was just telling me about some of the scams that are actually there in these spaces, as desperate migrant workers who want to head back home now realize that I have built everybody's life. Now it's time for me to build my life. And there are these scams that are coming up with, young men going out and saying, yes, here I am, I'm available, we can start a life together, and so on and so forth. Really looking at this dark side of people who gave the prime of their lives and now would sort of like to do that in the same way, end up in sort of this social construct, which is obscure for them to engage in, but then using the digital platform and using technology to try and make connections that actually do not exist, and end up really being on this losing side of the migration game. So at the end of the day, I think it's very important to sort of look at these things in a much more holistic picture from the migrants' perspective. The very last question that we have for you today, Professor Benoit, in the interest of time. I know we started a little bit late, so we're trying to make sure we're within the hour. We had a question sort of that looks at there are so many policymakers. There are many in the remittance market players. It's, as we've said, it's it's more than it's $1 billion industry, and both in terms of numbers and scale and scope, and with being a trillion industry in a couple of years. And then we have these, these different layers. We've got the family level that we've been talking about a lot, the individual, the migrants themselves, and now we sort of talk about this ecosystem. So we're talking about the regional level. That seems to be very important, and also trying to understand what is happening in the Asia region, in the Africa region, for the Americas, and in different spaces around the role that remittances have to play in terms of development, but also at that national level, where even some diaspora are being given a platform, even political space within parliament, for them to contribute because of the spotlight on that remittances has shown through the data, but also through the advocacy that actually civil society and migrants themselves have been trying to raise in terms of their participation in this, even though it's not seen as a collective participation, individual, but for for the general good. So what do you sort of see as the critical focus of these policymakers and remittance players at these levels in terms of creating the conditions for migrants that would contribute to development through remittances?
Thank you. Extremely important and difficult question. It takes me back to the origin of the GCM. You mentioned the GCM objective 19 and 20. Actually, they flow from objective 10 of SDG. Objective 10 is about equality. You see, and it actually mentions in target number 10 of objective of goal number 10. Target 10 is about reduction in transaction cost of remittances. That's the only time that the SDGs have referred to something which is related to migration. We do not have to pretend to say that SDG did or undid the missing part that was not noticed by the MDGs. Millennium Development Goal had migration had no role in that, and we were hoping that by the time SDGs be on the table, their migration will get the status of a goal of SDG. But amongst the 17, it didn't. Then there were, the migration lobby started looking at the target, 169 targets. It was nowhere to be found. The only place it was there in goal number 10, target 10, mention of the remittance cost. That was the only. It was another reason that why GCM was created. Well, I was speaking very passionately at that point in time in Mexico, giving a plenary lecture at Metropolis conference. And when I mentioned this, I was quite agitated when PSD missed the migration issue. I said first time it's a tragedy, second time it's a farce. That is a well-known statement. And to my surprise, I got a standing ovation. And there was a German ambassador was the chief guest there. And he said, I'm going to take it up with the United Nations. And we were not thinking that it would actually happen. But what coincided with that was the Syrian refugee crisis. That hit Europe. And that's why the GCM was brought onto the table to the back. That is hard reality, and not many people will concede that. But perhaps we do have the academics, the liberty to, to look into these and say it openly for the benefit of the civil society. What is important when you are saying what the policymakers, the lessons that should be drawn for the policymakers, are where are the trade-offs? The trade-offs are important to be taken into account. Remittances. What would happen if remittances go up? When will they go up? They will go up, as you had rightly mentioned, where the families are split, where the main worker is somewhere in the destination country, shedding sweat and blood, as Manjima had also mentioned. I have also referred to this term in my writings, and I had raised this in GFMD in Mauritius also, when the remittance was being discussed, that it is the outcome of the sweat and blood of the migrant. That migrant is lonely, alone. His family is not there, sending it to the family. If we fulfill the objective of family reunification, what would happen to remittances? Family reunification will go up, remittances will go down. So there is a choice, there is a trade-off. That has to be taken into account. I don't have the answer here. Whether we should have more families together or whether we should have more remittances. That is a question that needs to be raised before the policy. Secondly, you talked about diaspora. Now, COVID-19 gave us the instances of diaspora philanthropy. Now, philanthropy comes in various forms of remittances. whether it is food aid or it is medicines or it's a vaccine or it's money. But these are all part of the diaspora philanthropy. Now, who are these people? They are not migrants anymore. They are settled people. Their families are with them and they are still standing. So if they are sending, their family reunification has taken place and still remittance is coming in a different form. So this is where we have to put our minds together, that there is always a way out of these dilemmas, of these, ironies, of these conflict of situations, of trade-offs. It may take time. That's why I say it may not happen tomorrow, but it will happen one day. We have to have that patience of experimenting with the right policy and not throw the baby with the bathwater. That, I think, is many of the policymakers are throwing the babies with the bathwater. That right at the brink, when it is about deliver, that point of time, we find that the policies have changed. And that is what happens to visa policy, which is the very core of migration. We don't discuss it. It is a hot potato. No sovereign country, in the name of sovereignty, brings it on the multilateral. That all is spade a spade. Whether they derive from some good lessons out of it or they despise, that leave it to them. That's what I would say.
No, absolutely. And I think the one of the biggest emphasis, obviously, in this space is talking about financial inclusion, and you see various players, particularly those who are working in the space of remittances, so on the receiving end, in really trying to understand. And then, of course, COVID had that highlight on it, right? Because everything is closed, and usually remittances were sent through some kind of a box. With you had a monopoly of the market at some point by very big players, but that kind of also opened up the digital space, opened up and increased, and they say that has also contributed to the reduction in cost. I have to say, sometimes I think that the digital space hasn't reduced cost. What it does is that it just plays around with the exchange rate. This you sort of find out the more you engage with these different platforms, and also sometimes that the cost has just been shifted elsewhere, and the cost may even be shifted to the one receiving, so they're receiving less. And so this financial inclusion space is really interesting, and it's also interesting to still see that you still got part of those who want to engage or to be able to send money home and not have to be forced to have a digital platform to engage with, because when they show up at a place where they're sending money, it's sort of there's a whole ceremony around it, right? It's also a way of ensuring, is the money going where it's supposed to go? And for those that receive it, we know, for instance, in Africa, there's a very big emphasis now on mobile money and the fact that you can receive mobile money. And these digital tools, obviously, they played a very critical role during COVID, because people were immobile, but money could still be able to pass. But also very creative ways in which these cash-held remittances were not able to make it through. And so at some point, I think at the very beginning, they were even, experts coming out to say, yeah, remittances are going to go low. And then again, once again, migrants and diaspora came to the rescue, and those amounts just have kept on going up. And as we have heard from other spaces, they're saying that remittances are not about to go down, because like you've said, as long as we don't see objectives of family reunification, we don't see that change in the legal pathways, we don't see that change in the regularization, people will continue to send money home. And often, even just in different spaces, it's funny how remittances looks as such a big thing for global South countries, and yet it's not such a big thing for global North countries. You think about small countries like Finland, for instance, that has quite a number of people of Finnish origin that live elsewhere. I mean, does the Finnish government really wonder how many remittances are coming into its budget? It's not preoccupied with this, right? The same would go for smaller countries, but even bigger countries like Germany that still exports a lot of its own labor that is elsewhere. Is Germany really counting how much remittances are coming in? But I think that's also the positioning, and it's really interesting to see the reflections that are being shared with others in the chat as well, that in a way it's divisive, but how do we really give it that highlight as well? And probably my very last question, and everyone is also welcome to come in and share on this one, but Professor Binod, I often wonder, is it time for us to stop looking at cost and for us to start looking at volume? And is there, is it really important? Is the cost really important? Is the volume important? Because right now in the GCM, we're measuring the cost. We're so focused on reducing this cost. But is the volume what is important in terms of the bigger picture for sustainable development? So we can also give migration, if you like, a narrative to it at the same time?
Yes, I would think so, Freddie, that the cost is per unit, it's a rate. It's not the volume. You see, there is no contradiction between volume and rate. They can go hand in hand. Because if the volume is large, then the rate can go down. The transaction cost can absolutely go down. And that is exactly what I say, the principle of reduction in the profit. If the profit goes down, but the total sales, the number of units of transaction is larger, then your total saving on that particular transaction is large. That is the same principle here, that if the volume of remittances goes up, then it would pay for itself to bring down the cost of transactions. The number of transactions would be much higher, and per transaction saving for the agent, even if it is low, the volume of saving in terms of profit. But that depends on the volume of remittances and the volume of transactions. That I think there is no contradiction between these. That is what we the point is very important. We need to clarify it.
Thank you, Professor Binod, for this. Any questions as we are coming to a close? Any questions, reflections? Thank you so much, everyone, for having spent time together here with us and listening in, but also just being able to share different contributions that have come from the floor. Any questions or any reflections? Biju, thank you again for joining in your voice on the chat. I think you had a question saying, is it Bideshi Primiti? And I'm trying to practice here in Asames. That's the question that Biju Abraham had asked. And I don't know, Biju, if you wanted to be able to share this with us.
Yeah, he also mentioned about something, a possible term in Assamese, my language.
Yeah. Okay, all right, that's great, that's great. So we're opening up the space. Well, we see that remittances teaches us language, it teaches us a lot of different things, but I think what has been most important here is that it teaches us that there are many other spaces that we need to look at into the remittance ecosystem, and that we need to zoom back once again and focus back. So with that, maybe I ask Professor Binod, any closing remarks you would like to share with us to bring us to a close?
I think this is an opportunity. This is the discussion about remittances is an opportunity at migration as a holistic issue for not only those who are dealing with finances, dealing with money, but those who are dealing with all other aspects of society. That is very important. That's why I made the point that social scientists today are divided by their disciplines. They have come together under the same umbrella, but they are addressing the same issues, but they fail to communicate to each other what they're doing. So it's carrying old Newcastle kind of situation, where you talk to your own kind in your own kind of language, and then at the end nothing goes out, nothing comes in. That all has to be, that barrier has to be. That I think is very good. Rather, we should more engage social sciences where civil society, the activists, and other stakeholders can speak to us at the same platform, same level, same amount of confidence, rather than trying to dominate each other.
Thank you, Professor Vinod, for this. It's really been enlightening to have this conversation with you on the Expert Dialogue series with the focus on remittances, and really glad that we could hear and we could really learn from your wisdom on this particular topic. And we look forward to next series. We're still working on a couple of things that we keep juggling on. The topics will continue to change even as we go along, and sometimes we'll continue also to engage in some of these topics because the idea is to bring more expat opinions on this particular space. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Very happy that we could have a room that was very engaging. What is important for us is to really to be able to engage, and we will be sharing this video along and other videos that have been shared before on previous topics on the Expert Dialogue series. So from us, from JRFDT, would like to say thank you very much and wishing you all a very happy and good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.